I'm Joseph Bush again, and I'm a consultant by practice, and I do lots of different kinds of projects. I started an unusual project for myself, and that it involves a bigger commitment than usual to become part of an organization for at least a year and work with them on business classification in a records management context, but it's really much more than that. I wanted to talk about this, a particular aspect of this here. So the broad topic is sustainable economic development. I'm working with the African Development Bank, which is based in Abidjan in the Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. It's a multilateral, what's called a multilateral financial institution. And to me, the interesting thing about this is that there are many projects that need to be funded, and there's quite a bit of resource to do the funding. But the challenge is that you have to go through a very structured process that has very strict standard operating practices in order to plan for, do the due diligence around, make the grant or make the funding available, and then to monitor the funding of the project throughout its life cycle. So there's and all of this results in the creation of documentation, the very formal reports. So there's a real need to provide ways to make this as frictionless as possible, but it's a very different context than the ones that we've been discussing. Let's just see. Slides here. Yeah. Right. So there's a project at the African Development Bank to address this. They call the project Sankofa, but that's just sort of a code name, and it's really focused on how to capture and store documents effectively and develop the metadata associated with those documents so that they can be captured and then handled in ways that are important to support this this development funding life cycle. Those are all associated ultimately with key sustainable development goals based on the UN goals, and they focused on 5 particular areas. But I won't. What I wanted to do is primarily talk about what the connection between classification is and these sort of broad and lofty goals. So it's basically around the efficient documentation of the projects through the development life cycle. And to do that, they need to be able to classify the documents with the particular project and the project phase. And they need to identify what the type of information is when appropriate, and then provide the complete and consistent metadata. So this is different than the biological examples that we saw earlier today, but it has many of the same characteristics, just in a completely different domain. And many of the issues that were discussed earlier are relevant here. The particular use cases are a little bit different because this is a not exactly regulated, but it's an environment that requires accountability and compliance with transparency and other things of that nature. So it's important to classify the document by what the particular activity is that the document relates to, and then the particular type of document is. And those then become the basis for defining what are called record series, which describe the value of the document from a business perspective, and that in turn determines what the requirements are for retaining it in a records management environment. But there's also this public disclosure aspect of the problem, and that has to do with determining which documents should be disclosed, need to be disclosed, and which ones should not. And this is something that we do deal with routinely, for example, with medical records, that any item which has personal identifying information in medical record is something that is very confidential. And the same sorts of issues apply with these kind of documents. Which ones can be disclosed and which ones can't. There are some additional criteria besides whether they relate to individuals, and that has to do with whether they relate to what are called sovereign activities, that is between governments, or private activities, which has to do with entities which are not governmental. And those have certain requirements and agreements around access to information. So to get to the heart of this, what's a business classification? It is basically a type of taxonomy. It's not particularly an ontology, I would say. It's a bit less structured, and starts with high-level functions, which are easily agreed to. What are the key things that an organization does? And I'll show you an example of that in a second. And then what are the specific activities within those functions? That gets to be a bit more complex, because it varies from, let's just say, department to department. And then there are some things which are the same. There's something on the order of about 68 of them in this institution. If they're project related, there are some standard phases of those projects, and there's 6, I believe, phases of implementation that are standardized. And then there are record types. The number of record types is quite large. It's on the order of hundreds. It's about, I think, 600 or so now. So basically, you get this from a high level of agreement on broad categories, much less harmonization as you get further down this classification. So let's quickly look at some examples to give you the flavor of this. So functions are things that you might recognize. They're readily agreed to. They're often standardized in organizations. And while they might be different from one organization to another, these are fairly standard types of framing for the way large bureaucracies might be set up these days. So, and they've been limited to 10, and those are standard. Every entity follows and agrees to those. And the area in which projects fall is this 4th one: operations, programs, projects, and initiatives. So activities get much more diffuse, and this is an example of some of the types of activities that have been identified. Things like program budgeting or capacity building, communication. Some of these are very specific to, or more specific to, this particular organization. Others are more general. Phases are these standard project cycle management phases, and it's a convenient way to group documents, and there are standard documents and penultimate reports that occur in each one of these. And anyone who does large projects knows and is familiar with these kinds of life cycles, and the fact that there are key documents that are prepared usually at the end or at a routine period that covers what happens in those particular phases, and are required to be produced as a form of accountability. And then finally, records, and these are, some of them are very generic, things like correspondence or budgets, and others are quite a bit more specific. It's just a small set of examples. Why it's important is that each of the record types in this particular environment has 2 characteristics that get associated with it. One is what the business value is, and that's simply on there's a very simple 4-level scheme from transitory, which means it's not of great business value, to permanent, which means that it has forever business value. And then the security level, and that simply indicates whether it's something which is public or whether it's classified, and if it's classified, whether it's something which is highly classified or confidential, or whether it is something which over a period of time, the importance of keeping it confidential diminishes and it can be assessed for disclosure. The idea is that if you can identify a record type, you can consistently apply a business value and security level so that it doesn't have to be determined, isn't determined by the person who's, or the individual who's handling that document. In other words, it gets determined by the scheme and not by the instance. This is just a quick summary of what those two types of classifications are. One is related to retention, the other to disclosure. And then the other interesting thing about this project is that rather than, and this is pretty standard, rather than defining a master plan and then completely and then implementing it, it's built iteratively. So you begin with a unit and you determine what the plan is, what the classification is for that unit. When that's approved, it becomes part of the master file plan. It's a little bit more complicated in reality. So it's an iterative process where you build it up over time rather than completing it and then implementing it. There are arguments about why it's better to do a master plan first rather than to do an iterative process or do an iterative process. It's mostly a pragmatic consideration to do it iteratively. Some of the other things that we've been doing is trying to provide some editorial rigor to the labeling process through agreement on some standard, some conceptual editorial rules and some more a kind of standard practice editorial rules in order to allow the labels to be more consistent and to make it easier to harmonize. So that's pretty much what I had to say. I wanted to explain what a business classification is, how it can support and enable compliance with the policies that are necessary in this kind of an institution, and also to provide the kind of complete and consistent labeling that allows for effective and reliable search. And generally, like a good classification will be broad and shallow, and that's the case here where we have it's not terribly deep, and as you saw, it started with 10 broad categories that then were elaborated into 4 levels. We also provide some simple naming conventions that follow organizational standards, and that all enables this harmonization of variations so that we don't have, so that we have some common understanding of what's in each of those categories.